everybody. Welcome. Good evening. Welcome aboard. Thank you for joining us for listening to Casco Bay, the Clean Water Act, climate change, and more. Hi, I'm Will Everett. I'm the Executive Director of Friends at Casco Bay. Our mission is to improve and protect the environmental health of Casco Bay. We appreciate each and every one of you being here tonight. Now I'm excited about this event. Tonight, you are going to get to spend some time with two people at the heart of our work. And I'd like to invite on screen Casco Baykeeper Ivy Frignoca and staff scientist Mike Doan. When I'm out on the bay with Mike and Ivy, I learn something new every time I'm out there with them. Mike has been listening to the bay for more than 25 years. He's our longest serving staff person. Mike oversees our science work and how we measure the health of the bay through our water quality monitoring work. Ivy Frignoca, of course, is our Casco Baykeeper. She acts as the eyes, ears, voice of Casco Bay and is one of the most dedicated advocates for clean water I have ever worked with. And Mike and Ivy has spent the spring, summer, and fall out on the water together. And as they listen to the bay while on the water and through the data that we collect. So I'm going to turn it over to them and share what they've learned. Mike, take it away.
Great, thank you. Sweet. Hopefully I'm sharing my screen with everyone. Thank you, Will, of course, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I want to start by talking about where we listen to the bay, how we listen to the bay, and I would do that with our map of Casco Bay here. And what you're looking at is all of the sites we visit when we collect water quality data. And when we talk about the environmental health of Casco Bay, of listening to the bay, we do that through an ongoing long-term water quality monitoring program. And that program has two components. The first is our seasonal water quality monitoring program. And the blue dots you're looking at here on the map represents the sites that we visit. For that seasonal work, we visit each site once a month, May through October every year. And we just 2 weeks ago, I guess, completed our 30th year of collecting data through that seasonal monitoring program. So we're celebrating those 30 years here. The yellow stars you see on this map represent our other water quality monitoring program. That's our continuous monitoring program. You may have heard of us talk about our cages of science. And these are the 3 stations where we have those cages deployed. The star in the middle here off Yarmouth is our original continuous monitoring station, and we have data there for 7 years and a little more actually. The other 2 stations, Portland Harbor to the west and Harpswell to the east, are newer, but we did celebrate this year a full year of looking at data, listening to the bay from all 3 stations. So a lot of milestones, a lot of celebrations here. When we look at the water quality of the bay, we're interested in looking at various parameters, various measurements that tell us something about the health. We look at the temperature of the water. We look at the salinity of the water, the amount of oxygen in the water. We look at pH, which is a measure of the acidity in the water. We look at how much phytoplankton is in the water. We look at how clear the water is. That's a measure of water quality. And we collect samples of water to be analyzed for nitrogen, which I'll talk more about later why we do that. But all of these things tell us something about the health, the environmental health of Casco Bay. At those 3, we do that at all of our stations, but at the 3 continuous stations, we also collect data on carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. And from that, we can calculate out even more parameters. So there's a lot of different ways we listen to the bay, and we do that across the bay. And while we're out there monthly, May through October at those blue dots, those yellow stars are collecting data every hour on the hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365. It's a great volume of data that really allows us to talk about how the bay is changing over time, daily, weekly, seasonally, and annually. So I want to talk about the data that we collect through those 2 programs first, and I'll do that. And then I want to share with you 3 events or issues that snuck up on us or we worked on this past summer. at the end. So first, I want to share a graph of data from our seasonal work. And again, we're talking about completing our 30th year of collecting water quality data. And you can see across the bottom here, started back in 1993. And again, we just wrapped up our 2022 season. So 30 full years of water quality data through our seasonal program. What you're looking at is water temperature data collected over those 30 years. And each of these blue dots represents the average water temperature for any given year. And you can see there are years that are warmer or colder. There's a lot of ups and downs as you go through the data. But this red line represents the trend through all of that data, through 30 years of data. And it's absolutely showing an increase in water temperature, a significant increase in water temperature at a rate of slightly over now, 1 degree Fahrenheit per year. I'm sorry, 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade. That would be very scary. 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade, which is in line with what others are seeing around the Gulf of Maine. Over 3 decades of monitoring, we now have, on average, an increase in water temperature of over 3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is striking. Really, a large change over a short period of time, relatively speaking. And you'll note that this increase in temperature is going to affect everything else we do. I'll talk about this more in just a bit, but rising temperatures in Casco Bay really do influence and infiltrate really every other issue we're involved in. And that's the biggest takeaway, I guess. If your power goes out, if you lose Zoom, these rising water temperatures in Casco Bay really is the major issue right now. But let's jump to the continuous data. That was data from our seasonal program. I have a few slides now from our continuous monitoring program. And what you're looking at here is data from our original site, our original continuous monitoring station in Yarmouth. So just one of those 3 stations. You're looking at all of our data. The gray shaded area shows you the range of values from all the historical data we've collected at that site. As you move January through December across the graph, that shaded area shows you the mins and maxes of data for the previous 6 years. The dark blue line through that data is data collected this year, 2022. That's why that line ends in early October. That's the data we've uploaded so far from that Yarmouth station. So we're comparing this year's data to the range of all the historical data we've seen. And again, that dark blue line, the data from 2022, and we're looking at water temperature here, does spike in places above those maximum values throughout the spring and summer, including some of the highest temperatures we've seen when comparing this year against the historic data from this site. So again, reinforcing that notion that our waters are getting warmer in Casco Bay. And I'll stay with this style graph. So all of our historic data from our Yarmouth continual monitoring station, that range of data in the gray, this year's data in the blue, but now we're looking at dissolved oxygen values. And if you look here toward the end of the summer, you'll see that the dark blue line with data from this year is down below the average of all of the historic data. And in fact, there are some drops in that data that go below the minimum values from our historic data from this site. So we had a summer in Casco Bay where oxygen levels were low and lower than we've seen at that Yarmouth station. And the same is true. I'm going to stick with this style of graph for a second. When we look at pH, so again, we're still stuck with that continuous monitoring station data from Yarmouth. Our original station has the most data. All of that data is represented in the range of values in gray, and of course, the dark blue data from this year. And once again, summertime and into the fall even, we've had pH values that were low and lower than some of our minimum values in the historic data. pH is a measure of the acidity. The lower the pH value, the more acidic the condition. So we're looking at data, these past few slides that tell us that Casco Bay was, again, warmer this year. And we had a summer that was filled with low oxygen and low pH, meaning more acidity. So a rough summer for Casco Bay, lower water quality than we're used to. I'm going to stay with our continuous monitoring data. but I want to jump to a comparison of all three sites. So we're looking at data from just 2022, just this year. Again, that's why these lines stop here in early October, last time we uploaded the data. Now, though, each line here represents a different monitoring station. Now we're looking at data from all three stations from this year. We're back to looking at water temperature. We were looking at Yarmouth data. Yarmouth data here is in the green. The light blue line represents data from our Harpswell station to the east. And the dark blue line is data from our continuous station, our Cage of Science right here in Portland Harbor. And I've been waiting for a while to be able to look at a year's worth of data where we're comparing site to site, station to station, our continuous data. And what's really neat here is how the dark blue of Portland, the water temperatures in Portland were slightly warmer, relatively warmer, of course, in the winter, and then lower temperatures in the summer than our other two sites in Yarmouth and in Harpswell. And this would indicate that we have a lot of water coming in from offshore in Portland Harbor, representing some water that gets in there from around the corner from Portland Headlight, perhaps, and sets up in there. But we're starting to be able to see differences from site to site, differences in different parts of the bay in our continuous data, and that's really, really exciting. One more slide of this type. Again, we're comparing data from all three of our cages of science. Two things to take away here. Back when we had just that one station in Yarmouth, our original continuous monitoring station, we knew we were getting good data, really high quality data, but we didn't know how representative that data was of the entire bay. And that was one of the reasons we wanted to go out and add stations to the west in Portland Harbor and to the east in Harpswell off the New Meadows. So we could see if we were describing conditions across the bay. That string of stations lets us know how the bay is functioning across the bay. And we're seeing that. We hope that we would see the data kind of mirror the data from each station, be very similar in its trend over time. We knew the data would be different from station to station, but we really hoped we'd see something like this. The peaks and valleys really overlap. The data from all three stations kind of mirror each other in the trends over time. They're different. Some have, this is oxygen again. The Portland Harbor station has lower oxygen than the Yarmouth and the Harpswell stations, but the trend over time is the same. So we're more and more confident as we go through all this continuous data that we're really, with that string of three sites across the bay, really talking about how conditions are changing across the bay, looking at the bay as a whole. So that's a very exciting takeaway for me, how these stations, the data from these stations really mirrors each other. The second takeaway here in looking at oxygen levels is that we're going to focus on Portland Harbor again. Lower dissolved oxygen, so poor water quality in Portland Harbor, or at least reduced from these other two sites. You'd expect that Portland Harbor, large urban area, it has a lower water classification that the state puts on it. We'd expect lower water quality, and we're seeing that here in the data. Lower oxygen levels is lower water quality. I'm going to stop with data from our continuous and our seasonal work now and shift into some of the three items that I want to share with you, the events or issues that we dealt with this summer. But as I transition, I want to stick with oxygen for a second and talk a little more about dissolved oxygen. It's a very important indicator for us, and an indicator of the health, the environmental health of the bay, really for two reasons. And one is that everything in the bay, everything in the oceans needs oxygen. All the fish and lobsters and oysters needs oxygen to survive. Just as we require oxygen to respire, so does the critters in the bay. If levels of oxygen get low, they can become stressed. And if levels really fall off, get too low, they can die. So it's a very important indicator for us because it's important to all the critters that live there. The second reason why we like oxygen as an indicator of the health of the bay is that because it's one of the negative consequences from having too much nitrogen. And I'll talk about nitrogen pollution in just a second, and Ivy will as well when she comes on. But too much nitrogen in our bay can lead to too little oxygen for those things that need it. So for both those reasons, it's a very important indicator of health, of water quality. And I'm talking about oxygen because I'm going to come back to that in a second and actually contradict myself. But let's go to the first of the three things I want to share from the summer that aren't part of our ongoing work. And I want to stress that the continuous data, the seasonal data, that is ongoing work for us. That will continue for the next X number of years into the future. We'll always be out there doing that work. From time to time, we do additional work, and that's what you're looking at here. This is the Presumpscot River. And this past summer, it was wonderful to be able to measure the water quality in the river. As we're concerned, of course, about the environmental health of Casco Bay, we are more and more concerned about the conditions of the waters that are draining to Casco Bay, those urban creeks, perhaps, or in this case, the rivers, the Presumpscot River. What is the water quality in the river draining into Casco Bay? So we left one of our cages there, just above Presumpscot Falls, a beautiful area. So we're zooming out, going to drone footage now. We're looking at the Presumpscot Falls, and if you can follow my cursor, this the white dot there in the middle is actually Stafford Robbie Lewis Nash, who is flying the drone that is taking this image. Our station was just off that rocky outcrop where he's standing. And again, we looked at those same parameters to judge the health of the river. We looked at temperature and salinity and oxygen and many other of those same measurements that give us insight into the health of the bay. And I'll share the data now. We did that for a number of reasons that you'll hear more about in future events. But what I want to talk about specifically here, and that equipment, that cage of science, went in the Presumpscot June 22nd and stayed in there until September 21. So you're looking at the summer into the fall across the bottom of this graph. You're looking at two things: temperature in red and oxygen in blue. And don't worry so much about all the squiggles here. What I really want you to take away from this is that these two lines, the red line and the blue line, are mirror images of one another. They're inversely related. The red line for temperature, as that increases, you'll notice that the blue line, the oxygen, decreases. And I just explained how oxygen is influenced by nitrogen pollution, for example. Oxygen levels are also influenced by the temperature of the water because of the physics involved. Warmer water holds less oxygen, colder water holds more oxygen. And that's what you're seeing here. And I'm mentioning all this because as our waters get warmer, that's going to make everything else we're trying to measure more difficult to really tease out. It'll make our job harder and make the bay more susceptible to the things like nitrogen pollution. You can see as our water temperatures in the Presumpscot got really warm here in July and into August, we saw our lowest oxygen levels. Again, colder water holds more oxygen, warmer water holds less oxygen. As our bay warms, as our rivers warm, the concern is that we're seeing lower oxygen in places because of that. But in any event, climate change isn't a separate issue that we're worried about. Things like water temperature rise are going to make everything else we do, it'll exacerbate the other issues that we're concerned about. That's my real fear as well. So that's really why I'm sharing this data. There'll be other events where we'll talk more about the Presumpscot effort. But just it's a great example of that inverse relationship between temperature and oxygen, how warming waters will make things worse in Casco Bay. Jumping to the second thing I want to bring up, I want to talk about nitrogen very quickly. All living things need nitrogen. It's a critical component of life, but too much of it can be too much of a good thing. So we measure nitrogen in the bay. You'll recognize the locations of our seasonal sites on this map. These are those seasonal sites we visit, and this is nitrogen concentrations at each of those sites. We're just looking at data from the last 4 years. We look at the current condition of nitrogen in the bay. And the takeaway here are that these offshore sites that are green and smaller dots have lower nitrogen. That's more background, more healthy conditions. As we move inshore up into the bays, we see yellow dots, larger dots, so higher levels of nitrogen. And of course, the red dots have the highest levels of nitrogen that we see. And those are all the upper ends of the bay and in the rivers and urban creeks that drain into Casco Bay. So I just shared this with you to show that we're seeing a lot of nitrogen coming from land, from us, into the Casco Bay. That's something else I think Ivy will touch on later. But really why I want to share this slide of nitrogen concentrations and talk about why nitrogen issues are a concern to us is to share this slide. One of the things we did this summer was to have another nitrogen NAB event, and I do not have data yet. Sorry about that. It's on its way. I'm looking forward to sharing that data with you when it gets here. But these dots, these dark dots, represent sites where volunteers collected a sample of water for us all on the same day at the same time. This is something we absolutely could not do without the volunteer effort. And I really wanted to share this slide just to say thank you to all of those who contributed. It was a huge part of our summer. With this effort, once that data is in, we'll be able to really map the conditions of nitrogen across the harbor and really start to track sources of nitrogen and hopefully see that same gradient as I just showed you in that slide, that onshore to offshore or land to water gradient in nitrogen. We'll see what the data shows when it comes in, but really I just wanted to pause here and to say thank you to everyone involved. This was a heroic effort and I'm very excited to see the data. That brings us to the last issue, for me anyway, that we dealt with this summer. And it was a massive algal bloom, phytoplankton, single-celled organisms, so very, very small critters, but in great numbers, which is a bloom of phytoplankton. Numbers so large, they change the color of the water. This is a close-up view. This is a bloom in Macoit Bay that persisted for weeks. I want to take a second and just note that this is an image shared with us from water reporter Glenn Michaels, who was a tremendous help in letting us know what these things look like, where these things are occurring. And I want to give a shout out to the entire Water Reporters program. And if you have any interest in becoming a water reporter, please see our website. It really allows us to have eyes on the bay beyond which we could do as a staff. That's a close-up view of this bloom. As we zoom out to drone footage like we did earlier, this is the upper Macoit Bay. It's a very large bay. We're looking at just the upper tip. Brunswick is up here above Macoit Bay. But what I want you to focus on here is this large tongue of olive brown green water. The water is discolored because of the vast number of phytoplankton, single-celled organisms in it. A huge bloom that lasted for a very long time. It would need to be a large bloom to discolor the water this much. You want obviously, blue waters like you can see here in places around the edges, but this bloom was much bigger than what we're looking at here. It filled this very large bay. We were up there collecting data. You can see this bloom from the boat. It was that pronounced. The data showed extremely warm water temperatures close to 80 degrees Fahrenheit in this bay, showed low levels of oxygen in the bay, low pH, which again means more acidic water. So a number of stressors in this embayment. In addition to the bloom itself, there were clam mortalities associated with this. It's a number of stressors all at play, and I'll leave you with this. It's worrisome to me that we may see more of these. Hopefully this was a one-year event, a 2022 thing that we can leave. My concern is as our bay continues to warm, we'll see more events like this. As we continue to see nitrogen runoff from land, which feeds or fertilizes blooms like this, stimulates blooms like this, we'll see more of this. So I hate to close on a negative note like that, but hopefully Ivy has better news, and so you can put a positive spin on things. But it was a tough year for Casco Bay, warmer, places with lower oxygen, and places with a little more acidity. So we'll keep at it. I'm going to turn things over to Ivy right now, Casco Baykeeper Ivy Frignoca, who can join us and talk to you about what the Clean Water Act addresses and where we're going to go with that. So Ivy, if you're there, sure, yeah.
Do you want to stop sharing and I'll put
I
up
will
my screen?
Stop sharing there
Thank
and
you.
let you take it from here.
Hi, everyone. It was just a joy to spend another season out in the field with Mike by land and by sea. And I think you saw there was a photo of him in the Presumscot River with our newest staff member, Heather Kenyon. She's our science and policy associate. You will get to meet her, and she really augmented our field efforts this summer in our analysis of the data. So as you know, we collect data and use that as one of the ways we listen to Casco Bay, and that helps inform how we can act to improve and protect the health of Casco Bay. And at this point in time, because it's the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, and I just am waiting. There we go. Little one of those tech hiccups, there's a little delay there. The first thing that we want to do is just pause and say happy birthday or happy anniversary. Last Tuesday, the Clean Water Act turned 50 years old, and it has helped us and helped Casco Bay in so many ways. When the Clean Water Act was passed, waters were literally catching on fire. They were so polluted, and so many of our magnificent rivers, including the Presumscot, were just dumping grounds for industrial waste. And so the question is, how is the Clean Water Act helping us? How can it help us with some of the issues that our data raised, as Mike shared with you? And first, just want to take a little look at how the Clean Water Act is structured in a very simple way so that it can help with our discussion. So the really great thing that the Clean Water Act has done is it regulates point source discharges of pollutants to our waters. So what that translates into is a point source is a pipe or any other conveyance like that, a drainage ditch, etc., of a pollutant to our waters. And what the Clean Water Act was initially intended to do was reduce discharges of wastewater, commercial, and industrial sources. And it also provided a lot of funding for sewage treatment. So in that regard, it's been a huge success. In 1987, the Clean Water Act was amended to address certain categories of stormwater. That's represented on the left-hand side here. And the category of stormwater we most track through the Clean Water Act, and one of the ways we most work to reduce stormwater pollution at Casco Bay is by helping tighten the requirements in the municipal separate storm sewer permit, the MS4 permit that you may have read about in our newsletters and emails. And that permit regulates the collection of stormwater and the discharge of stormwater to our waterways in our largest urbanized areas, which in Casco Bay includes the Portland and South Portland greater urbanized area. So that's what the Clean Water Act does, and does really well. How does it do that? Well, first, you heard Mike talk a little bit about water quality standards. The Clean Water Act requires states to set water quality standards for all rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. And those standards have to determine the designated uses, the criteria, and have to set requirements that say you can't degrade the water quality of that particular class of water. An example of a designated use would be what quality of habitat must be maintained. And an example of a criteria, I'll pick one that we've been talking about, is what level of dissolved oxygen must be maintained. So that's very, very important, because all of our waters have to get assigned to a water quality class. Once that happens, then the amount of pollution discharged to the waters can be set through discharge permits. And in essence, the way the Clean Water Act works is it says, thou shalt not pollute unless you have a permit to do so. And the permit sets the amount of pollution that can be discharged, and it has to be low enough that it either works to improve a water body or to protect it from degradation. And some of the features that we look for when we review these discharge permits are what are the monitoring requirements in it, particularly when we see an area that has a new issue of concern. So for example, in the areas of the bay where it appears that too much nitrogen is causing algal blooms or degrading eelgrass beds, then we might ask that nitrogen levels be monitored. Another thing that these discharge permits do is they set limits on the amount of pollutants that can be discharged. And fortunately, they renew every 5 years. So as new problems emerge or new information is known or technologies advance, the terms of the permits can be revised. So this is very important because this is how we use the Clean Water Act to take the data that Casco Bay, what we're learning from the data about Casco Bay, and act to improve and protect the bay. Doesn't answer all the problems. For example, this doesn't address the non-point source pollution, the stormwater that just sheets off our landscape into our waterways. So now turning to what Mike was talking to you about. The Presumpscot. This is the first time we have done continuous monitoring in a river. And why did we do this? Well, in tan, what you're seeing is the Casco Bay watershed. This entire area drains into Casco Bay. 2/3 of this watershed is drained by the Presumpscot River. So no healthy Presumpscot, no healthy Casco Bay. And we were able to work collaboratively with partners along the river to better understand the health of the Presumpscot this summer. And the segment we were particularly interested in is the last freshwater segment of the river before we get to head of tide and the waters turn salty. And that segment goes from just below Sacarapa Falls in downtown Westbrook to the head of tide, that slide that Mike showed you with the waterfalls in Falmouth. And that segment is currently Class C. And the big question is that segment of the river healthy enough to be upgraded to Class B? And so that's what our monitoring was for. And if you can think back to the slide Mike showed you, there were times, especially this summer, when we had such a severe and extended drought and water temperatures got high, that there were dips in the morning hours below 7 parts per million of dissolved oxygen concentration. No need to memorize that. The point is that 7 parts per million, that's the standard for Class B. So at these high temperatures in the morning hours before photosynthesis starts and oxygen is generated and released into the water, there were dips below the Class B standard. What that ultimately means for the health of the river, we don't know yet. We know what the data is telling us, and we're striving to understand what that means for the health of the river. Another issue Mike brought up was the bloom in McCoy Bay. We did see another big bloom there in 2017 that covered 14 acres of flats and smothered all the quahogs under it. And I think there was a bloom years ago in the bay that also caused clam mortality, maybe in the late 1980s. But there was this bloom again this year, and what was also really concerning was the warm water temperatures. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with McCoy Bay, but it's this shallow bay, and the upper part of it is in Brunswick, and Brunswick has done a great job managing this bay to restore wild clam fisheries. And so the upper bay at low tide is pretty much just extensive clam flats, and it supports a robust commercial fishery, clam fishery. So seeing issues in this bay and the health of it is very concerning, both from a commercial perspective for the people who make their living there and just an overall health of the bay. So what can we do under the Clean Water Act? This one's a little difficult because we can look at nitrogen levels, but there aren't direct discharges into here that I think would be regulated under water quality standards. Brunswick, although it's a burning area, isn't yet big enough to be covered under that municipal stormwater permit we talked about earlier. So it's not regulated there yet, although we think it could be by the next permit cycle, but that won't be till 2027. So this is an area where the Clean Water Act might be able to help us, but not right now. And so the things that we'll be looking at are maybe collecting more data to better understand the nitrogen loading here, looking at if Brunswick's willingness to pass a fertilizer ordinance similar to what Portland and South Portland did. And then this red line here shows you the outline of the McCoy Bay watershed. This area in black of the watershed is identified in their current, Brunswick's current comprehensive plan as the growth zone boundary. I know some of you have emailed me in the last couple weeks about a proposal to take this large undeveloped block in the targeted growth zone and put in 900 housing units. And at the time that the comprehensive plan identified this as a growth zone, it was quite a while ago. And before certainly the problems were known that exist in McCoy Bay today in this fragile, rich, shallow embayment. And so another thing that we'll be working on that would be covered if this municipality were under the stormwater permit is to see if Brunswick will look at building regulations that require the use of development techniques that treat all stormwater on site, that require techniques that allow natural percolation of water into the ground, and other methods to ensure that development does not harm water quality. So we're working on this, some potential for Clean Water Act, a lot of other more localized work probably to address this issue. Mike talked to you about the nitrogen NAB this summer. We were so excited. So many of you showed up and it was a brutally hot, dry day. And what was great about that was the last time we did the NAB in 2016, it rained the night before, and it rained enough that there were the stormwater outfalls had water flowing in, combined sewer overflows had water heading in, and urban streams had water heading into the Fore River. And so if you look at these concentrations over here, we get concerned at concentrations over, say, 0.30 or 0.32 milligrams per liter, and we start looking for impacts on the health of the bay. And you can see that everything from this storm event back in 2016 is above a level that might cause us concern. And so we're very, very interested in looking at the data that you all helped us collect this summer that shows a dry weather event, so we can compare it to this data and get a better understanding of nitrogen loading to Portland Harbor. And why is this important? The state is working on a process now to amend the water quality standards for the marine waters class C and B to include nitrogen criteria. In other words, to set the number that above which nitrogen can't be discharged into the bay because it will negatively affect the health of the bay. So that number is being worked on, and this data will help us in those discussions and will help the state set the most protective number for Casco Bay. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk more about climate change and the incredible work of the continuous monitoring stations. So there's so much to try to tease out about how water chemistry is changing in response to excess greenhouse gas emissions and other changes. One of the things that Mike does is he takes the data from the continuous monitoring station and he does a series of calculations. And one of the calculations he does is to determine how much calcium is available and ready to be absorbed in the seawater by organisms that form shells like clams, oysters, and mussels. And this is an older slide, and I chose this slide because it's easy to look at and discuss. It shows you 4 years of data, and these are Mike's calculations. And when the level of calcium in the seawater, it's called omega aragonite, is above 1.5, it's easiest to form shells. When the number is below 1, it's really hard. And somewhere in this zone between 1.5 and 1 it's harder to build shells. And our understanding of exactly what is the level, is it 1.5, is it 1, is evolving as science evolves, and more data is known and more papers are published, and more exchange of data occurs between scientists. And what we're doing to make sure to be part of the dialogue and to make sure that Maine is best poised, Casco Bay and Maine are best poised to understand how our marine waters are changing, is Mike and I started a monitoring collaborative last summer, and it's with scientists from the University of New Hampshire all the way up through the Canadian border, with scientists from the Passamaquoddy Nation. And we meet and we talk about how we're monitoring for these changes in carbonate chemistry and ocean acidification to our coastal waters. And we work together to advance our understanding of what the data is telling us. And it's just a very exciting group, and it helps fulfill a goal of the Maine Climate Council, helps fulfill our mission, and it just helps us advance the science in real time in ways that can help us best protect Casco Bay. So I'd like to invite Mike back on and Will, so we can get to your questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ivy and Mike. There are a lot of questions, and we will try to get through as many as we can. And the first have just for you, Ivy, when we think about climate change, there's climate change, and then there's our work to reduce pollution in our waters. What's the relation between those two? When you think about climate change, how important is it to reduce stormwater? How is that related to climate change?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to give a two-part answer and invite Mike to add to this. So in part, if you take something like nitrogen that is delivered in stormwater, nitrogen fertilizes these algal blooms, right? Either the massive phytoplankton blooms like Mike showed, or the big green mats of algae that many of our water reporters have helped us document for the last 4 or 5 years. And as those die off, they release carbon dioxide. And so the carbon dioxide combines with seawater, makes it more acidic. So one of the factors is that that stormwater loads aggravate what we're seeing in terms of coastal and ocean acidification. Another factor is that on a stormwater sense, although we're seeing periods of drought, we actually have more precipitation per year than we did. And so the amount has gone up, I think, since the 1890s by like over 6 inches per year. And it's being delivered in more intense storms. So the stormwater loads that we're getting are more intense and delivering bigger loads of pollution to our waters. So some of the work that we're doing in permits is to, in response to climate change, to reduce these bigger loads of stormwater. I think that addresses it on the stormwater side. Mike, anything else to add to that?
That's really it. Just overall, climate change makes everything we've already been trying to do that much harder for us and harder for the Bay, I think.
The two things I would add is that it also makes us rethink how water quality standards are interpreted, because now we have these higher temperatures. So I think that's a real look at how we're measuring water quality. And then the question, it also leaves aside that the causes of climate change aren't necessarily water pollution. So we also have to do advocacy to reduce air pollution and other sources to reduce the pollution that is aggravating the Bay.
Sure. And Mike, waters are getting warmer. Some of our folks out there attending this event have noticed there's also weird smelly things growing on their boats. On things. Can you talk about some of the slimy, smelly things that we see on our boats and on our continuous monitoring stations, and what that means for the bay.
Sure, I've seen more things growing on both the boat and the stations that we deploy, those cages of science. It seems like more and more every year, and I wonder if it's just the warming temperatures inspire growth, faster growth, more growth. There's a lot of things out there looking for a place to live.
Right.
More of them as it gets warmer.
And more tunicates.
Absolutely. Yep.
Some of which are invasive, is that?
Yep, certainly.
All right. And the tunicates are those slimy, orange, brown. How would you describe them? I wish we had a photo that we could just pop up here.
Yeah, they cover other things. They coat things like a flat. Yeah, it's hard to describe without a photo, but more green algae as well, I think, showing up on dock lines and around the edges of the boat.
And Ivy, we talk about how we use our data for Clean Water Act permits and monitoring water quality standards. Have we found any places in the bay where water quality standards are not being met?
That's a good question. I would say the one that consistently comes to mind is the New Meadows. And and it's so hard because there's two roadways there that really restrict the flow of water. And so that's an area where I think we always see issues with dissolved oxygen. And then Mike, the other one that comes to mind is sometimes the Royal River.
Yep. Upper Royal River, just below the falls, is one. Even occasionally the upper Harrisicot as well. So up in, closer to land, near shore.
My apologies. We had the tech hiccups, but not the I forgot to feed the cat before Zoom. And so she is really reminding me that it's past kibble time. Sorry about that.
Well, that's why I have our door locked here to keep my 3 cats out. So we talked about a lot of different places in the bay. We haven't mentioned the Harrisicot River in Freeport. One of our attendees mentioned that the river was at times very cloudy this summer, and they want to know, is the sewage treatment plant being monitored? And Ivy has done some important work on this, and Mike has done some important data collection on in the Harrisicot. So I'll turn it over to you, Ivy, first, and then Mike can jump in.
Actually, I was gonna Mike, what did we see? I don't recall seeing any blooms in there specifically. I mean, the cloudiness I would think is either suspended solids or a bloom. Do you have any documentation of that in our data from this summer?
Boy, I'd have to go back and double check, but I think we did see remnants of that bloom. Nothing like what we saw in McCoy or Middle, but that large bloom really did affect a large chunk of the bay outside McCoy. So it could have been part of that bloom as well.
So because I was going to say, my guess would be what they were seeing in the Harrisicot was some sort of phytoplankton bloom or whatever. And then the question about what impact does the treatment plant have on it? The Freeport, the wastewater treatment facility, its permit was up for renewal this summer. And so we did submit comments on that permit. And the question that we have is about evaluating the nitrogen levels from the treatment plant. At the discharge pipe itself, the nitrogen levels are pretty good. But in the area around the discharge pipe, in the area where we know that the effluent mixes into the Harrisicot, there is one area that does have high nitrogen levels, and we sometimes see green algal mats in. And so we've asked the Department of Environmental Protection to take a look at that and to evaluate whether the treatment plant is contributing to those high nitrogen levels. So I don't have any data or any information from this summer that shows that it caused the cloudiness in the water. But we are concerned. The area where we're concerned about is back by Porter's Landing. The effluent sort of stays there. And I see someone putting in about organic material from the estuary. That is one of the questions we have, like what nitrogen levels are we seeing that are related to the estuary or land loading? What's coming from the treatment plant? We don't know the answer. We're asking the question. So in response to this question, we too are asking questions
Yes.
about overall how that upper Harrisicate is functioning.
Great. And then, so this summer we saw and fall a return of the cruise ships. We saw one leaving, was it yesterday or today actually? The return of the cruise ships coming into Casco Bay. What can we say about how they may or may not be affecting water quality in Portland Harbor? One of the questions is with 10,000 passengers and staff, that's a lot of wastewater on those cruise ships.
Mike, I want to ask you first, did you pick up any signal or anything in our data when the cruise ships returned?
Not in our data, no.
Okay.
Nothing really changed as far as that. I was going to point out the no discharge zone that
yes,
they helped get into place.
So yes, so one of the big pieces of advocacy from the past is that Friends of Casco Bay advocated for Casco Bay to be a no discharge zone. Again, Clean Water Act, that is something the Clean Water Act allows. And so the cruise ships are not allowed to dump their effluent into the harbor. And I began looking through the records for the cruise ships, and I don't think they're discharging gray water or ballast water here either, but haven't finished my research into this. So because Casco Bay is a no discharge zone, we are protected from a lot of the pollution that could be caused by cruise ships. The other issue of concern is the air pollution that they cause. And federal regulations require the cruise ships to put in a scrubber to clean particulates out of the stacks before there's a discharge of pollution into the air. And one of the types of scrubber systems is called an open loop scrubber that takes in seawater, uses it to help take out the particulates, and then discharges it back into the sea. And I was into the bay, and I was concerned about that. And so have been looking at the regulations, but it looks like they're required to treat the water if they do the open loop scrubber system before they discharge it. So as of right now, we too we get a lot of questions about cruise ships. We're looking at it, and we're hoping to do a more in-depth analysis this winter. But we asked, so far, we're not seeing that the cruise ships are having any big impact or negative impact on the health of Casco Bay.
Science question for you, Mike.
Great.
This is a little in-depth one. Are the plankton blooms causing lower dissolved oxygen levels? And this astute attendee says, it looks like in July we had high dissolved oxygen, suggesting a bloom and a die-off in the fall.
Yep.
Question mark?
Nope.
Oh.
Exclamation mark. That is true. Yeah. Phytoplankton blooms will, through photosynthesis, initially add a lot of oxygen to a water body during the day when the sun's out, and overnight through respiration, that large bloom can take a lot of oxygen out of the water. When they're living, as that bloom dies and decomposes, that leads to even more oxygen being removed from the water. So you will see an initial spike in oxygen or higher oxygen levels at the surface perhaps, and lower oxygen levels down in the water column, down at depth. But initially, yes, more oxygen, but both through phytoplankton respiration and then the decomposition process, lower oxygen eventually. And I think that's what we saw in the data from Casco Bay. We had okay conditions early on, but the fall really looked like low oxygen and low pH as well.
And let's head back up to that bloom near Brunswick. Mm-hmm. Was the bloom related to combined sewer overfalls and stormwater releases? And if I'm thinking the water treatment plant's actually on the Androscoggin side of Brunswick. Yep. So I don't think that are combined sewer overflows, but I could be wrong, but I'll leave that for Ivy and Mike.
Yeah, I don't believe there's any. Actually, I'll leave this to Ivy. Is there any CSOs on the McCoy Bay side? I don't think so either.
Yeah.
So a lot of the concern from some residents and shellfish harvesters up there have been more around the stormwater and nitrogen flowing from lawns and other things, rather than actually pipes.
It appears,
Exactly.
Will, that the loading is more non-point source, not those point sources like combined sewer overflows or municipal storm sewer outflows in the McCoy Bay watershed.
And this is the 50th anniversary, as you said, of the Clean Water Act. It's actually 50 years and 1 week old as of today. And we had a question about how do nitrogen levels and pollution compare to the battle days in the 60s and 70s. And I know back then, when we look out on the bay, today we see thousands of sailboats and recreational boaters. Sailboat magazines in the late 60s and 70s actually said, hey, if you're skip Casco Bay. But do we know much about the pollution levels then compared to now? Mike Gravy.
I haven't seen data from back then, but knowing that the Clean Water Act brought treated sewage, that's a dramatic improvement to the bay, and I would have to think they were lower today than they were then.
I think the answer is we probably don't know, right? Because the point sources were reducing, but the non-point sources, like the built environment, has increased.
Yep.
What I'm going to speculate is the answer to this is that when the Clean Water Act was passed and you had waters catching on fire and huge fish die-offs and people getting cancer, nobody was looking at nitrogen pollution. Like there was such a crisis to be solved that the big issues had to be addressed at that time. And as the Clean Water Act cleaned up, sewage and commercial and industrial sources, then these other problems began to come to light. And so we now know that we can't restore our waters without addressing stormwater, non-point source pollution, and some of the loads of pollutants that stormwater carries, which may include things like PFAS and some other things that we haven't even talked about yet. But right. I think back then when you're in like crisis mode, like, oh my God, let's put out the fire and like get this water functioning. It just probably wasn't on people's radar. So I don't know that I haven't seen any data from back then. I've certainly seen it from, I did my undergraduate work on Lake Champlain and I saw a lot of phosphorus, I think, in fresh water back then because of farms and things like that affecting fresh water.
And a shout out here to our first staff person, Joe Payne. And part of the question about data, part of the reason that we started our water quality monitoring program when we first started 30 years ago was that no one really had a handle on data in the bay. And Joe Payne and our early board and early volunteers launching our water quality monitoring so we could get a handle on that. So well, great. Well, we've reached the 6:30 mark, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And I would just like to share 4 things that you can do as we leave here. First, if you're inspired by our work and inspired by clean water, please be a member, donate. You can do that on our website. And if you've already donated this year, please consider a special gift. The second thing you do is volunteer. You've heard how important it is to have volunteer water reporters out around the bay, helping us keep an eye on the bay. Please volunteer. The third thing that you can do is join us in person on November 12th. We have the cinematic celebration for Casco Bay, and this will be an in-person 12 films that we're showing at Abramson Auditorium in Portland. And if you are not going to be in Portland or large crowds aren't your thing, you can join us online and watch those films online. And fourth, tell a friend about our work. We are friends at Casco Bay, and we can't do this work alone. We need more friends out there helping us. So please share this work and our emails and things that you're inspired by the Bay. Share them with your friends and neighbors. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Night.